From Trotsky to Tito. James Klugmann 1951 Chapter 5, Role and Tactics of the Titoites Today. 2. Arsenal of anti-Soviet slander. Like his forerunner Trotsky, Tito's role is not only to aid the war plans of imperialism against socialism, but to supply imperialism with a permanent stream of anti-Soviet, anti-communist, anti-socialist lies and slanders, dressed up in left-wing language, in revolutionary phrases. This is shown most clearly by the mass of material put out by the Yugoslav embassies in nearly all countries of the world and also, in foreign languages, from Belgrade. Never in history has the world been flooded with such a mass of official government-inspired propaganda, sent out in dozens of languages to hundreds of thousands of people, free, unasked for, unwanted, as appeared from Yugoslav official sources inside and outside of Yugoslavia in the last 3 years. From the weight, literally in tons of wordage dispatched in all directions, it is perfectly clear that the payment for this propaganda does not derive only or even mainly from Yugoslav sources, but that dollars and pounds have got mixed up with the dinars. Gilas, who plays a role of the Gobelson type in the Yugoslav state machine, has added to the Yugoslav Information Office a special department for propaganda against the Communist Information Bureau, which in 1948 received 40 million dinars, and in 1949 over 100 million. The Yugoslav radio disseminates its slanders abroad in some 14 languages. It can now be understood why the British government so readily acquiesced in the Yugoslav demand towards the end of the war for equipment to repair the main radio stations and to enlarge the radio service. It is sufficient to take any series of recent Titoite publications and to do a brief mathematical analysis, to see how these new kinds of communists devote their attention to attacks on communists and progressives, whilst they leave unscathed the Western capitalists except for an odd occasional remark of mild criticism thrown in for demagogy. Take, for instance, the first 30 issues of the Yugoslav Bulletin published by the Yugoslav authorities in London between November 1949 and June 1950. Here is a brief analysis. No one contains attacks on the World Peace Congress and the British Peace Congress. No attacks on Western imperialism. No two contains attacks on the Daily Worker, on Hungarian People's Democracy. No attacks on Western imperialism. No 3 contains attacks on the British Peace Committee, the International Union of Students, the British Yugoslav Association, an organization of friends of the Yugoslav people, and therefore critical of Tito's regime. No attacks on Western imperialism. No 4 contains attacks on the British Yugoslav Association, the New Hungary and the Communist Information Bureau. No attacks on Western imperialism. No 5 contains attacks on Bulgarian People's Democracy, falsehoods on Dimitrov, attacks on the Soviet Union. No attacks on Western imperialism. No 6 contains attacks on the World Federation of Trade Unions and on the New Hungary. No attacks on Western imperialism. No 7 contains attacks on the Bulgarian government. No attacks on Western imperialism. No 8 contains attacks on the Communist Information Bureau and attempts by a series of twists to justify Yugoslav trade with the West by pointing to Soviet trade policy. No 9 contains attacks on the Soviet Union and a boost for the anti-Soviet propaganda of Mr. Ziliakis. Numbers 11 to 20 contain, amongst other things, attacks on the Communist Information Bureau, many, on the British Yugoslav Association, the International Union of Students, members of the British Communist Party, the World Federation of Democratic Youth, the Bulgarian government, the World Federation of Trade Unions, and the Soviet Union. Many numbers 21 to 30 contain attacks on the International Union of Journalists, on the Communist Information Bureau, many, on the Soviet Union, many, on the International Association of Democratic Lawyers, on Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Albania, Romania, Hungary, on the Peace Petition Campaign, and on the Spanish Communist Party. This is a very short summary of the anti-Soviet, anti-communist, anti-progressive attacks and slanders of 30 issues. In many cases they take up the major part of the bulletin. The criticisms of Western imperialism, if enlarged, could be put in a teaspoon. Is it surprising that this new kind of communism pleases the capitalists? This type of analysis could be repeated for any section of the Yugoslav press in the last 2.5 years. Take, for instance, For the Defense of Peace, published by the so-called Yugoslav Committee for the Defense of Peace. Note 12 for January-February 1950 contains, amongst other items, attacks on the Communist Information Bureau, on the World Federation of Trade Unions, on Soviet science, plus articles on Yugoslav medieval art, and on Motsi, a Chinese philosopher contemporary with Confucius. There is an attack on capitalism in a reprint of a speech made in 1910 by a Serbian socialist, but nothing more modern along these lines. No capitalist warmonger or financier would hesitate to give this to his children. Here is a thoroughly nice kind of peace movement, a joy to the warmongers. Or take the first issue of the so-called Review of International Affairs, published in July 1950 by the Federation of Yugoslav Titoite journalists in English and other languages. This peculiarly reactionary journal, the aim of which is to create an international Titoite forum, contains amongst other things, attacks on the Communist Information Bureau, the Communist Party of Italy, the Soviet Union, the Communist Party of Israel, Soviet philosophy, the Soviet magazines Nanya, the Italian communist organ Unite, on Izvestia, on the Soviet writer Simonov, on the Moscow radio, the Czechoslovak government, the Belgian communist organ Drapeau Rouge, Radio Prague, Radio Budapest, on the Socialist Unity Party of Germany and the Communist Party of Western Germany, and on the Spanish Communist Party. Most of the articles are written in left-wing language. It would be difficult to find in any Tory journal, or even in any old publication of Goebbels, so much concentrated anti-Soviet and anti-communist slander in so relatively short a space. It should be added that this is a mild issue compared with more recent numbers. Or take the organ of the so-called Yugoslav Communist Party, Borba. In the 105 issues starting from the 7th of January 1949, covering 4 months, there is not one editorial or signed article attacking British or U.S. imperialism. In these same 105 issues there are 174 leading articles and long reports containing general attacks on the USSR and the people's democracies. Between the 1st of March and the 1st of May 1949, Borba contained 13 long articles attacking Albania, 15 attacking Bulgaria, 8 attacking Hungary, etc., etc. But all this belongs to the earlier, milder, more impartial period of Titoite propaganda. In 1950 the attacks on the Soviet Union, people's democracies, communist parties, peace and democratic organizations, grew larger, louder and more frequent. And the silence on Western capitalism was replaced by more openly whitewashing articles lauding the home and foreign policy of the imperialist powers. Is it difficult to understand, therefore, why Tito's Borba is one of the most quoted papers in the right-wing press and the press of the right-wing labor leaders in Britain, America, France and Western Germany? The anti-Soviet, anti-democratic slanders of the Titoid press are taken up avidly by the right-wing press of the capitalists. Tito's Yugoslavia has become a principal arsenal of such fabrications. Amongst a whole section of the people, the open sources of the Tories, trusts and their ilk in other lands are suspect. The more cunning and twisted Titoid lies are taken up, therefore, as those of the Trotskyists were taken up in the 1930s. The Times and Telegraph, Daily Express or Daily Mail, New York Times or New York Herald Tribune, Hearst Press or Wall Street Journal repeat almost verbatim, sometimes with acknowledgement and sometimes without, the inventions of their colleague, Borba. The New York Herald Tribune correspondent in Belgrade writes in the Continental edition of the 6th of April 1950, Belgrade charges the Komine form every few days with new obscure anti-Yugoslav acts of an unsavory nature. He cites a few of the charges of the first few months of 1950, acts of Romanian secret police attacks on Czechoslovak government, acts of Bulgarian secret police attacks on Danube Commission, etc., etc. All these slanders were widely reproduced in the capitalist press. All the capitalist press in Britain and America joyfully recorded the Titoid version of the alleged slow murder in a Czechoslovak prison of a Yugoslav, D.M. Dmitrievic. Borba's inventions, disseminated all over the world in the Tanjug bulletins and other Titoid publications, gave rise to countless articles in the capitalist press on the evils of the police states behind the Iron Curtain. For all the red-baiting and red-hating editors, a cheap source of Iron Curtain stories. In fact, Dmitrievic was arrested in Prague along with a number of other Yugoslavs as a party to a conspiracy against the Czechoslovak government and to illegal currency dealings. He died, medically well cared for, from a long-standing heart disease. 10,000 examples could be given. The New York Herald Tribune, Continental edition of the 4th of July 1950 headlines a sensational story of Russians seizing Czechoslovak oil fields. In this story there is not a grain of truth, but its acknowledged source, Belgrade. The same paper on the 6th of July 1950 splashes the headline Eugene Forga called boss of Hungarian trade with the subtitle Tito newspaper glass says Soviet economist is economic dictator. There is not a grain of truth in this, but its acknowledged sources, Belgrade. The communist leaders of Italy and France, Palmiro Togliatti and Maurice Thorez, both very ill, receive much-needed medical treatment in the Soviet Union. The capitalist press wants a gutter story, some special piece of anti-communist nastiness. The New York Herald Tribune, Continental edition of the 11th of January 1951 carries the story that they have been summoned to Moscow to receive orders for the subordination of their countries to the USSR. Even the capitalist press seems to jib at inventing this on their own initiative, so it is reproduced with the dateline, Belgrade. A patient study of all that is most reactionary in the right-wing press of the capitalist world would show that it has one of its most fertile sources for anti-Soviet, anti-People's Democratic, red-baiting material, the press and information offices of Tito's Yugoslavia. If in 1949 the main line of the Titoite press was to launch attacks and slanders on the countries of socialism and people's democracy, leaving the West unmentioned, in 1950 it began to pass more openly to praising and whitewashing Western imperialism. Exactly as had been disclosed at the Reich trial, the plan of campaign was, first, to boost Yugoslavia, make Tito Yugoslavia the center of attraction of all eyes, distracting attention from the role of the Soviet Union. Secondly, to pass by stages into open attack against the Soviet Union and the people's democracies, ignoring the West except for a few faint criticisms to add realism to the anti-Soviet slanders. And thirdly, to pass more and more openly to whitewashing Western capitalism. On the 7th of April 1950, Tito interviewed The Times. His theme was "The West is better than the East." On the 27th of April 1950, Tito addressed the joint session of both houses of the Yugoslav National Assembly. The Daily Herald, the 28th of April 1950, reporting him, headlined "Tito says we turn to West" and described it as his most conciliatory speech to the West. On the 29th of April 1950, Alexander Worth reported in the Manchester Guardian Tito's press conference of the previous day in these words. Tito remarked that there had been no political pressure from the West. Altogether, he suggested, development of economic ties with the West had made up economically for the damage inflicted by the Comintern boycott. The American government, the Tories in Transport House were trying with increasing difficulty to justify the Marshall Plan and to disguise the colonizing nature of American aid. They were meeting with increasing resistance. So Tito was thrown in to explain the generous nature of Western imperialism, to explain that capitalism had ceased to be capitalism. But on what issue do the capitalists most need the assistance of Titoite propaganda? Surely it is in carrying out their central purpose, the preparation of aggressive war against the countries of socialism and people's democracy. As step by step the people in the rear of capitalism begin to feel the danger of approaching war, imperialism needs the help of Tito to lull them into inaction. As step by step the people in the rear of capitalism begin to see that it is their own governments, their own rulers who are preparing aggression, the capitalists try and cover up their war preparations by disguising their aggressive aims and plans as defense against the alleged aggression of the USSR and the people's democracies. Truth has to be turned on its head. What better instrument than Tito? As step by step the people in the rear of capitalism hear the Soviet Union's concrete proposals for peace, for the peaceful solution of all problems and issues arising between West and East, between the great powers, and come to see that the Soviet Union and the people's democracies want peace and are working for peace. Western imperialism tries to conceal and then to distort the peace policy and all the peace proposals of the Soviet Union. Here again is a role for the Titoites. As step by step the peoples in the rear of capitalism, together with the peoples of the new world of socialism and people's democracy, begin to band together, unite, organize in a world movement for the defense of peace, isolating and exposing the warmongers, it becomes essential for the governments of the USA and Britain, for the trusts, Tories and right-wing labor leaders to attack, compromise, disrupt this movement, which they so much hate and fear. So to complement the open attacks on the peace movement from the open reactionaries, the wily arguments of the Titoites are thrown into the struggle. An essential role of the Titoite propaganda is to try and break the unity of the international progressive movement, the World Federation of Trade Unions, the World Federation of Democratic Youth, the International Union of Students, and above all the World Peace Movement. Under the cover of their usual pseudo-revolutionary phrases, the Titoites set out to lull the peoples into a false sense of security by denying the imperialist drive to war. I do not think there is any immediate danger of war. A hot war is unlikely to replace a cold war. Tito, interview with the Times, the 8th of April 1950. Next, they set out to prove that the ceaseless efforts of the USSR and the people's democracies for peace are nothing but an insincere and hypocritical maneuver. This became increasingly important as the continued impatient efforts of the Soviet Union and people's democracies for peace, their repeated concrete peace proposals and attempts at peace negotiation began to impress even right-wing people in the capitalist countries. So the big capitalists turn on the Tito tap. In a leading article on the 5th anniversary of V-Day, Borba, the official organ of the Yugoslav Communist Party, attacked Soviet policy as essentially imperialist and said that the insincerity of the slogans for peace was manifest in the Russian attitude towards Yugoslavia, with its propaganda campaign, economic blockade, and warmongering speeches. The Times, the 10th of May 1950. Next, the Titoite propagandists set out to prove that the danger of war comes not from Western imperialism, but from the Soviet Union and the people's democracies. Whenever the Western capitalists are launching some new campaign of aggression, in Vietnam or Korea or Malaya, or preparing some new warlike bloc or some new rearmament, the Titoites are put up to launching a war scare replete with slanders against the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe. Whenever the Titoites themselves take some new warlike step on their frontiers, they tried to throw the responsibility onto their neighbors. If Western war propaganda is threatened by a spell of peace, the Titoite press is put up to discovering some new menace on their borders. Thus in Belgrade on the 17th of May 1950, the Titoite information chief Tito proclaimed that there were hostile troop movements on Yugoslavia's frontiers. This was propaganda invented specially for foreign consumption. It is perhaps significant that the more alarming statements in Ndadier's speech on Soviet war preparations in the neighborhood of Yugoslavia were not quoted in today's Belgrade press. It would seem probable that the statements were primarily intended to put foreign opinion on the alert. Manchester Guardian correspondent in Yugoslavia, the 18th of May 1950. In mid-July a new incitement campaign was launched. The Narodna Armija army paper at Belgrade invented reports about Bulgarian troop movements together with extraordinary measures adopted by Romanian troops on the Yugoslav borders. On the 23rd of July 1950, Eric Bourne, Sunday Times correspondent in Yugoslavia, reported, from the usual Titoite sources, Hungarian, Romanian and Bulgarian troop movements on the Yugoslav frontier. This corresponded with a particularly urgent need to whitewash the movements of American troops in Korea. On the 29th of December 1950, the New York Herald Tribune correspondent in Belgrade took up the same refrain. U.S. aggression in Korea needed to be forgotten. Yugoslav rearmament coinciding with a desperate economic situation needed to be justified, so Marshal Tito charged Hungary, Romania and Bulgaria tonight with having 600,000 men under arms. The Marshal accused them of carrying out widespread military preparations against his regime. New York Herald Tribune, Continental Edition, the 29th of December 1950. This was at a moment when events in Korea were leading towards a widespread movement in Britain, America and the West generally for a negotiated peace. So, along with Truman and Churchill and Chiang Kai-shek, Marshal Tito's aid was required to divert the peoples from the path of peaceful settlement, assailing, at length, the notion of peace at any price with Soviet Russia. The Marshal denounced what he termed the Munich type of peace. See also Hearst Press for this slogan, J.K. It is the peace of the aggressor in which one or several nations are enslaved in the hope that eventually the aggressor will be satisfied. This peace is only fiction. It is not peace. New York Herald Tribune, Continental Edition, the 29th of December 1950. So whenever Truman or Churchill or Morrison need an excuse for their warlike moves, the Titoites provide the pretext. And, finally, in their work of abetting the Wall Street drive to war, the Titoites set out to prove that the worldwide popular movement for peace is a communist maneuver, just as the Trotskyists in the 1930s set out to show that the worldwide movement for collective security and against fascism was a maneuver of the Communist International. When the world petition against the atomic bomb was in the first place in the popular struggle for peace, it was against this campaign that Tito, banning the petition in Yugoslavia, directed his propaganda machine. To compromise the organized peace drive of the World Peace Committee, the Titoites set up a phony Yugoslav Peace Committee whose sole efforts were to try and divide from within the broad peace committees of other countries. Co-mind-formed propaganda slogans for peace are hypocritical. The Times, the 10th of May 1950. Reporting a Borba article, Marshal Tito said precious time was being wasted in debates on the outlawing of the atomic weapon. No empty declarations and catchwords but concrete acts can show who is for peace and who is not. United Nations Correspondents Association interview with Tito by telephone, reported in Manchester Guardian, the 26th of May 1950. So at a time when the fight for peace, in the face of the war drive of Western imperialism, is the central task facing all progressive people in the world, the Titoites set out to whitewash the warmongers, to turn truth on its head and put the onus of blame on the peace-loving powers, to slander the peace proposals of the Soviet Union, to disrupt the world peace movement. Hitler too had his peace propagandists working along these lines. 2. Titoites at UNO. This same role has been played by the Titoites inside the United Nations organization. By the end of 1949 it was becoming increasingly difficult inside UNO to hide from the peoples in the capitalist countries that the obstacle to peace came from imperialism, that the USSR and the people's democracies were loyal to the UNO Charter and were ceaselessly putting forward concrete plan after concrete plan for the preservation of peace according to the UNO Charter. The Molotov says no myth was wearing very thin. It was Bevin, Hector McNeil, Acheson, Truman who were saying no to every concrete peace proposal. The Soviet representatives proposed the abolition of the atomic bomb with international control. The answer was no. They proposed a reduction by 1/3 of the armaments of the 5 great powers. The answer was no. They proposed a 5-power peace pact. The answer was no. They made proposal after proposal, concession after concession. The answer remained always no. Public opinion became restive, impatient. Some new weapon was needed to throw cold water on the Soviet proposals, to justify the Bevin, Atchison rejection of every proposal for peace. This was the special role of the Titoite representatives at UNO. The right-wing attacks on the Soviet proposals were threadbare, so throw-in attacks from the left there followed the usual division of labor. At the 4th and 5th General Assemblies of UNO, both at the plenary sessions and in the sessions of all the committees, whenever Soviet or People's Democratic representatives rose with a concrete proposal, up jumped the Titoites, Cardle or Vilfan or Dadier or another, violently attacked the proposal in pseudo-revolutionary phrases, branded it as hypocritical and insincere, launched a savage series of slanders on the country of the proposer, and sat down to the applause of the U.S., British, Chiang Kai-shek, Philippine and other U.S. satellite delegates. Then up got the U.S. or British representative, heartily agreed with the intervention of their colleague from Yugoslavia, took up the slanders, and rejected even discussion of the original proposal. Here and there the Yugoslav delegate would abstain, to prove his independence, but on all critical issues he voted westwards. When sectors of the U.S. right-wing press objected to these occasional abstentions, other sections, more far-sighted, would answer, "These abstentions are necessary to show the independence of Tito, because if he was not independent he could not remain a really useful satellite." At the beginning of October 1949, the Soviet representatives were making concrete peace proposals at the plenary session of the 4th General Assembly. The ball was passed to Cardle for the Titoites. In debate last week before the General Assembly, Yugoslav Foreign Minister Cardle specifically charged the Soviet Union with interference in Yugoslavia's internal affairs. He also said that a nation cannot profess peaceful intentions while heaping upon Yugoslavia the threats the government of the USSR is showering upon her. United States Information Bulletin, put out by U.S. Embassy in London, the 7th of October 1949. Of course, Mr. Cardle, our colleague, is correct, echoed British and American representatives. How can we even discuss so hypocritical a proposal? And the capitalist press, concealing or distorting the Soviet proposals, headlined the Titoite slanders. Or a few days later, in the Economic Committee of the same General Assembly, the Soviet Union and People's Democracies drew attention to the policy of boycott of East-West trade followed by the U.S. government and put forward concrete proposals for better and wider East-West trade relationships in the interests of peace and of the economic conditions of the people. Up jumps the Titoite Dr. Vilfan. The United Nations Economic Committee has been presented with an analysis showing the sharp contrast between Soviet methods in international economic relations and the proposed United Nations program for technical assistance to underdeveloped areas. The comparison was drawn by Dr. Joseph Vilfan of Yugoslavia, who accused the Soviet Union of imperialist practices. United States Information Service, the 10th of October 1949. Of course, echo the British and American representatives. Dr. Vilfan is right. The Soviet Union is imperialist. Long live Truman's Point IV. The debates continue. The Socialist and People's Democratic representatives make proposal after proposal. With demagogic phrases the Titoites launched their attacks. Yugoslav delegate Sava Krasinovic said it was a glaring contradiction for the Soviet Union to urge a new peace pact, while its Comintern allies were being urged to use any means to overthrow the Yugoslav government. United States Information Service, the 2nd of December 1949. The United States Press Service throughout the world distributed the Titoite cylinders, boycotting the peace proposals. The capitalist press echoed the Titoite cylinders, keeping silent on or distorting the peace proposals. The imperialist delegates, happy to learn from the Titoites that socialism was imperialist and imperialism generous, agreed with, supported and echoed Titoism. At the UN Economic Committee for Europe meeting at Geneva in mid-1950, the same role fell to the Titoites. Once again the representatives of the countries of socialism and people's democracy were calling attention to the reactionary trade policy of the USA, its orders to its dependents to cut trade with Eastern Europe, and the delegates of imperialism felt embarrassed. Feeling in countries like Britain, France and the Scandinavian states was growing more and more resentful of American economic dictatorship. The understanding was growing that submission to U.S. orders to boycott or cut trade with the East was leading step by step to increased colonization and subordination to crisis-ridden U.S. economy. Opinion was growing for a turn to increased East-West trade. How could submission to the dictates of Wall Street be justified? Once again the ball was passed to the Titoites. Mr. J. Vilfan of Yugoslavia replied that his country had had the opportunity to become a colony of the Soviet Union, but had refused the offer, and that apparently the Soviet Union can think only in terms of satellites or masters, never of independent states. United States Information Service, Information Bulletin of Yugoslav Embassy in London, the 10th of June 1950. Splendid, say the representatives of capitalism. Isn't it clear, as our communist colleague says, that it is the Soviet Union and not imperialism that is imperialist? What is all this nonsense about the USA forbidding trade with the East? Think of poor little Yugoslavia boycotted by the imperialism of the socialist countries, and their eyes fill with tears as they think of it. The Yugoslav delegate has made grave and convincing charges against the Soviet Union and other countries of Eastern Europe. The fact is that a small country finds itself completely and unilaterally cut off from trade with certain of its nearest neighbors. Mr. Asher of the U.S. delegation, speaking after the Yugoslav representative at UN Economic Committee for Europe, reported in United States Information Service, the 10th of June 1950, how the Tito, Truman lie of Soviet imperialism is the precise opposite of the truth, of the facts of history, we examine in detail in Chapter 7. And at the Fifth UN General Assembly at the end of 1950 the same committee continued, not only on the general issue of peace, but on the concrete issue of Korea. Now the Titoites have been rewarded by U.S. imperialism with a seat on the Security Council, to the joy of Churchill. There, too, an occasional abstention was permitted to the Titoites to add emphasis and increased prestige to their general support of American aggression in Korea. There, too, there was division of labor. And whilst the openly right-wing press justified directly the American invasion and the illegal UN decision, the Titoites concentrated on twisting the issue by endeavoring to show that the Korean War was the fault of the Soviet Union and the Communist Information Bureau. When at the end of June 1951, the Soviet proposals were made known by Mr. Malik for a ceasefire and for peace in Korea, it was the Titoites who privately took the initiative in advising the U.S. government against acceptance, It has been the Yugoslavs who have taken the initiative and have been warning the Americans against any letdown of anti-Soviet alertness. They have gone so far as to caution the Americans against the danger of falling into a Soviet trap in the Korean affair. This type of uncompromisingly anti-Russian advice to the United States is reported to be relatively rare in other European capitals. New York Herald Tribune, the 9th of July 1951. Indeed, such advice as given by the Titoites came only from Syngman Rhee and Chiang Kai-shek. When the Political Committee of the Fifth General Assembly of UNO discussed the Soviet proposal for a declaration for the elimination of the war danger and for strengthening peace and the security of nations, Cardle denounced the proposals and declared that he would vote against. When the violation of human rights was discussed, the Titoites denounced, not British authorities' shooting down of Nigerian miners, not the Union of South Africa's treatment of its African population, the overwhelming majority, not the U.S. treatment of Negroes, but Hungary, Bulgaria and Romania. The Titoites supported the illegal re-election of Trotsky as General Secretary of UNO. But above all, they have thrown in their weight on Korea. When the Soviet representative challenged the legality of the Security Council's decision on Korea of the 27th of June, Yugoslavia abstained. When the Soviet delegates called on the USA to cease bombing the towns and civilian population of Korea, Yugoslavia abstained. The Titoite Foreign Minister Cardle blamed the Soviet Union and the Communist Information Bureau for American aggression in Korea. It is not, he declared, a struggle of the Korean people for independence, but the liberation hopes of the broad body of that nation who too, as in many other parts of the world, have been misused to serve the purposes of an alien hegemonistic policy. The peoples of Yugoslavia cannot help comparing the events in Korea with the fact that we are now in the third year of the incessant rabid aggressive campaign of the Komintern governments led by the USSR. Cardle's speech on eve of departure from Belgrade to the General Assembly of UNO, Yugoslav fortnightly, the 15th of September 1950, not one mention of American aggression, of the mass dispatch of American troops to Korean soil, of the total absence of Soviet troops from Korean soil, not one word that could offend Truman or Churchill or Chiang Kai-shek. In December 1950, Vladimir Dadier, described by the Times correspondent in Belgrade as the member of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Yugoslav People's Assembly, and a close associate of Marshal Tito, published an article on Korea in the Communist organ of the Central Committee of Tito's Communist Party. What caused the untold suffering of the Korean people? What is behind the ceaseless bombing by U.S. planes and shelling by British and U.S. warships of Korean towns and villages? Why are U.S., British, Turkish, Siamese, Philippine troops killing Koreans on Korean soil thousands of miles from their homelands? Mr. Dadier has an answer. Mr. Dadier sees events in Korea as a manifestation of the Soviet will to dominate the world. If this is to be resisted successfully, the workers of the world must realize that yet another pretender to world domination has appeared, and get rid of illusions about the Soviet Union representing some alleged force of democracy and peace. The basic task of the Soviet bureaucracy is to slow down the development of the Chinese Revolution and to complicate her international situation for her. The Times, from Belgrade correspondent, the 27th of December 1950. Not even a word of concern about U.S. policy. With all its pseudo-Marxist phraseology, Dedier's article makes the Times editorials or Walter Lippmann's articles in the New York Herald Tribune look like the writings of Reds and make the declarations of Jawaharlal Nehru appear like those of a dangerous revolutionary. Can it be wondered that the Titoite articles and speeches on Korea are headlined in the Hearst Press, one of the most right-wing weeklies of imperialist America? The U.S. News & World Report published on the 28th of July 1950 a long interview with a top Yugoslav official in Belgrade. The interviewer declared, "That appears on these pages contains the answers made by a top official of the Yugoslav government. Both the questions and replies have been discussed by the Tito cabinet. So the views expressed here represent the authoritative opinions of the Tito communists." To the question, "What is your interpretation of the Korean situation?" the top official gave the following authoritative opinion: "This conflict in Korea is sheer camouflage on the part of the Russians. The USSR wants to confuse and complicate the situation in the Far East. It wants to provoke a war between the U.S. and China. This is the key to the entire issue. Russia's action in Korea is rank aggression. The USSR is planning aggression not only against Yugoslavia, but also against other countries in Europe. It would like to subordinate all of Europe." The U.S. News & World Report almost weekly calls for the arming of Western Germany, Japan, Franco-Spain and Tito Yugoslavia. It is more critical of Mr. Attlee's Britain than of Tito's Yugoslavia. And can it be wondered? Can it be wondered that in November 1950, Truman declared that Tito Yugoslavia fully corresponds to America's strategic and political interests? In November 1949, the Communist Information Bureau, in its resolution on Yugoslavia, declared that the transformation of the Tito-Rankovic clique into a direct agency of imperialism and accomplices of the warmongers culminated in the lining up of the Yugoslav government with the imperialist bloc in UNO, where the Kardeljs, Jalases and Blurs joined in a united front with the American reactionaries on vital matters of international policy. The year that followed brought a still closer and more open identification of the Titoites with the war policy of Wall Street. Like the Trotskyites of the 1930s, the Titoites, under the cover of pseudo-revolutionary phrases, provided an arsenal of anti-Soviet, anti-communist, anti-progressive slanders that complemented the open propagandists of Tories, press lords and right-wing labor leaders. Like the Trotskyites, their successors the Titoites supply endless copy to satisfy the requirement of everything most filthy, reactionary and warmongering in the press of the United States and the capitalist world.